Okay, now the recording is going on. Then secondly, I would ask you to please mute your mic if you are not speaking. I think when the presentation is over, then you can open your mic and ask questions, of course. And then, of course, during the presentation, feel free to write your questions, remarks in the chat, and then we will definitely discuss it after the presentation. Then I would like to give you the advice. Some French-speaking colleagues or guests might not understand English perfectly. We do have a simultaneously translation. I would like to ask you to check the PDF and Word attachment to this invitation, and there you find precisely how you can listen to the French translation, please. All right, then I think I will hand over to Magnus for the opening words, please. Magnus, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear representatives from the multi-actor partnerships. The Business Support Facility for Resilient Agriculture Value Chains project is implemented by GIZ projects, Agri-Business Facility for Africa, in short ABF, and also from the Market-Oriented Value Chains for Jobs Growth in the ECOWAS region, project MOVE. On behalf of the German government, of Economic Cooperation and Development, as the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, and the Department for International Partnership of the European Commission and the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, OECPS, under the Samoa Agreement. The project aims to develop and enhance the capacities of actors along agricultural value chains, namely cashew, cocoa, livestock, cattle, sheep and goat, in brackets, and maize. The idea is to attract finance and investment towards low emission and climate resilient practices in the ACP member states. The project has three main components. The first one is skills for agribusiness development. We scale successful agribusiness training approaches and tools through face-to-face trainings. The second one is a competitive matching grant fund. We mobilize resources for implementation through introducing a financial instrument that facilitates private investments and promotes the transformation agribusiness. And last but not least, we have the South-South exchange component. We support knowledge sharing and learning for further scaling, what we are doing now also with this expert talks. With this expert talks, we want to bring a little bit of fresh air to the project. We would like to address current issues relating to the promotion of agriculture value chains and at the same time also support the multi-actors partnerships that are supported by the Matching Grant Fund in the implementation of their activities. The motto for this expert talks is listen, reflect, and join in the discussion afterwards. I would like to take the opportunity to refer to the third call of the Matching Grant Fund to support innovative ideas in the cashew, cocoa, maize, and livestock value chains. The call will start next Monday, 8th of July, with a readiness program to prepare applicants by means of webinars. The deadline for the submitting proposal is the 18th of August. This year. All information of the third call can be found on the following websites I have now, or I will post now in the chat. So you have the links where you can go and see if this is perhaps something where you would like to motivate your partners or you would also participate yourself. So I wish the event good and fair discussions as well as a successful outcome. Thank you very much, especially also thank you to our speakers today. Back to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Magnus, for this words of introduction, words of welcome, and also those very useful information. So, the European Union Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, a quite difficult word. CSDDD. What is it? Is it a milestone to stop human rights and environmental violations? Or is it an obstacle for producers and traders? This is a quite tricky question. And yeah, we have invited Lena and Janis to shed light on this topic and to help us, what does it mean for our partners in the Global South? What does it mean for our cooperation? And we are very happy to listen now to your presentation. I would like to give over to you. The floor is yours. Welcome, Lena and Janis.
Thank you so much, Stefan and Magnus, for your introduction, and thank you so much also for the invitation. It's our pleasure to present on the law you've just mentioned. I will call it CSDDD for short, which isn't that short either, but a bit easier than the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Lena will share the slides in a moment, and I can use the chance to introduce ourselves. We are both advisors in the sector program for sustainable supply chains. That means we both advise the ministry in Germany for development on sustainable supply chains with a focus, because we both have a law background. Lena as a lawyer, we advise mainly on legislation, and in the last year, most of our time has been taken up by advising on the CSDDD, the law we are talking about today. Thank you very much, Lou, for sharing the presentation. I think we can go to the second slide with an overview of what we will talk about today. So it's a bit tricky to have this, to talk about the law, because as we will see later in our presentation, it doesn't directly apply to suppliers in the supply chain. It affects directly the large companies based in Germany and the EU, but it will have a lot of indirect effects, both on rights holders and also on suppliers. So this is what we want to talk about today. First, I will give an introduction, talk a little bit about the context and where this legislation comes from. Then Lena will present the details of the CSDDD. We will try to make it as easy to understand as possible, but I think it is important to understand the details to then understand what effect it will have on suppliers. And then I finish with the last bit to explain the indirect effects, the challenges, but also the chances that this law brings for suppliers. And then we will end with some accompanying measures that the German government is taking to support. And we're also very happy to answer all your questions that you can, I think, post after the presentation, but also during the presentation in the chat, as Stefan has already said. So let me start to give you a little bit of the context. So we are seeing globally a lot of risks and violations of human rights and also damage to the environment. Give some examples here of forced labor, of workers, of miners exposed to dangerous chemicals, of textile workers exposed to dangerous chemicals, working conditions that are harmful to humans and the environment. And the EU, or the EU companies, have a big part in it. And with that, we think, have responsibility how their corporate actions, how their business activities affect people in their supply chains. And this is why this law has come to why the EU has passed it. And next slide. Can't see the next slide yet, but I will just continue. Thank you. So I've mentioned human rights and also the environment. So there's global consensus, I would say, on certain human rights, on labor rights. We mentioned here on our slide the International Bill of Human Rights from 1966, also the ILO declarations on fundamental principles and rights at work, the core ILO obligations. So we have all these international conventions on what is considered human rights, and we have environmental treaties. But these treaties or these conventions are mainly directed at states. So there's a state duty to protect. And what we've seen in the last decades has been an extension of this duty and say, well, of course, states have a responsibility to protect human rights and the environment, but we also have to consider the actions of companies, because we all know that business has a big impact, both for good. I mean, it creates work, it can create prosperity, but it can also have a negative impact. Business activities can be harmful for workers, can be harmful for farmers. It can affect and damage the environment. So this is why the UN in 2011 published the UN Guiding Principles, saying next to the states, also companies have a responsibility. And what they did is they took the concept of due diligence, something that is well known in the corporate world, and said, well, companies, you can use this concept of due diligence to also look at your supply chains and see where in the supply chain do we have a risk for human rights violations or for environmental damage. What is our part in it? Like, how does our activity affect human rights, the environment, and how do we have to change the way we do business to deal with these risks and to prevent violations? These were voluntary guidelines saying we expect companies to be active, not yet laws. But what we have seen in Germany, that most companies do not follow these voluntary guidelines. And this is why first the German government and now also the EU have decided we need legislation. We want our companies in Germany and the EU to take up their responsibility. We don't want them to harm human rights and the environment through their business practices. And if they are not acting on it voluntarily, then we need laws. And this is why we have since 2021 the German Supply Chain Act, and why now since 2024, since this year, we have the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD in short. And you can go to the next slide. I don't want to go too much into the details of the legislative process in the EU that is extremely complex and complicated. So you don't have to focus too much on the content of the slide. You can also look at it later when we share the PowerPoint presentation. But what is important here to understand is that the EU law doesn't go into effect directly. It has to be, it forms the framework and the baseline, like the minimum standards. And now all the member states of the EU, Germany, France, Spain, many others, they have to create their national laws based on the CSDDD. CSDDD is giving the minimum standards. So what we will see now in the next 2 years, that all member states in the EU will create their own national laws based on the CSDDD. So we will now explain to you in more detail what is in the CSDDD, what are the rules for German and EU companies, but then it will take another 2 years until the national laws will become active. And then, as I said in the beginning, after this part of going a little bit more into the detail, we will also say, what does it all mean for suppliers? What does it mean for rights holders? For all the companies that are not directly in the scope of the CSDDD. Over to you, Lena.
All right. Thank you, Janis, and hello, everyone, also from my side. Yes, I would like to dive in a little bit deeper with you now into the CSDDD. And I would like to talk to you about the scope, the obligations, and of course, access to justice, which is a very, very important aspect. So first, of course, the most important question is, who does this directive actually apply to? And first, the statement that you can see on the slide is very important, that only large companies are affected. And then furthermore, you can see that there is a differentiation between EU companies and non-EU companies. And there are certain criteria and prerequisites that are being developed in the directive in order to determine when a company falls under the scope and when not. So I think it's important to stress that most of the times, suppliers of EU companies will not fall under the scope, or will not be directly affected by the directive or by the transposed laws in the national member states, as Janis just explained. And of course, they will not be subject to a fine or civil litigation or anything, as long as they don't meet these thresholds that you can see here. So you can see that if we want to enter a bit more into this graphic here, you can see that EU companies are affected in a staggered, or that the directive will be applied in a staggered way. So starting 2027, only the biggest companies will have to apply the directive. So that means all companies that have more than 5,000 employees and more than 1.5 billion net worldwide turnover. Then the next year, the threshold is a little bit lower. It will be 3,000 minimum employees and 900 million net worldwide turnover. And then finally, 2029, the threshold will be even lower, and it will be 1,000 employees and 450 million net worldwide turnover. It's also important to note what Janis just explained, that of course the member states, they have a certain discretion when it comes to the transposition of the directive into their national laws. So they may decide to already start in 2027 to apply the directive to all of the companies if they want to. But the directive gives the opportunity to kind of stagger the application in order to give companies a little bit more time to adapt to the provisions of the directive. So I just want to mention there are also the non-EU companies that will be affected by the directive. However, as you can see, there is only one prerequisite that will be applied. It's only about the net turnover, and it's not about the worldwide turnover. As for the EU companies, it is only about the net turnover within the EU. So it doesn't matter how many employees that company has. It only matters how much money do they make in the EU. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so now we saw who the directive applies to, and now, of course, it's also important, what does the directive aim to protect? And the directive, it does not establish any new rules or any new rights. It just kind of collects the internationally recognized human rights and environmental rights. So the quote-unquote most basic human rights, like the right to life, the prohibition of forced labor, freedom of association, living wage and income, that are enshrined in the human rights instruments and conventions that are and have been agreed upon and ratified by the vast majority of the states in the world, like the ILO core conventions and the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights. And of course, just Just to mention it, that also environmental impacts are protected. There is a list of prohibitions in the directive enclosed. And of course, environmental related human rights are also protected. Like, let's say, for example, if there is a strong pollution in rivers or on the land, and this has an effect on the people that live there in that area, that could also be protected under the directive. Next slide, please. Okay, that's the last part of the scope. So we saw who the directive applies to. We now know what the directive aims to protect. Now it's now the final part is what part of the company's activities are affected by the directive. So you can see here that both upstream and downstream activities of the company are affected. So there was a bit of a discussion in the legislative process how these activities should be called. So there was a discussion if it should be called supply chain or value chain. In the end, the agreement was chain of activities, which is a very broad term. And also with respect to the upstream, so the design, development, sourcing of the product, that's all covered by the directive. With respect to downstream, it is a little bit more limited. So only the downstream activities that are for the company or on behalf of the company are covered. Next slide. Yes, thank you. Okay, so this is, I think, in my opinion, the most important slide and most important page that we will be looking at today, or maybe the second most important. So what are the obligations that the companies have under the directive? You can see here they are listed in the directive. So it's 8 obligations, 8 or 9, that the companies have to adhere to. And the first one is the most, or the forms kind of the framework or the basis for the obligations, which is that the company has to implement a so-called risk management system. And based on this risk management system, all the other activities have to take place, like the risk analysis and also what kind of preventive measures. So they have to really structure their company according to these due diligence obligations. That's part of the risk management system. And of course, most companies, they already have kind of a risk management system, but now with the directive, they will have to adapt that according to the human rights and environmental aspects, so that they also cover that. So far to the risk management system. And then I already mentioned the companies will have to do a risk analysis along their chain of activities. And all of the due diligence obligations are on a risk-based basis. So this also refers to the risk analysis. So maybe to explain it a bit better, if a company has several chain of activities, let's say one being consulting and the other one being extractive industries. So it's expected from the company, but it's also allowed for the company to start their risk analysis with the extractive chain of activity, because usually that's the chain of activities that's more prone to human rights violations. So this is like a underlying thought of the directive, that everything that the companies do can be risk-based and should be risk-based. That doesn't mean they don't have to look at their other chain of activities, but it means they can prioritize. And then if the companies found a risk that has not realized itself yet, they have to take preventive measures. If there is a violation of human rights that, or of the environmental rights that has already taken place, the companies have to start and mitigate these violations or these adverse impacts. And possible preventive measures could, for example, be that the companies look at their procurement process, for example, and see, okay, our supplier, he really pays low wages. Could we maybe higher the prices that we have? Like in the purchasing practices, could we maybe change that in order to accommodate our supplier a bit more, so it puts them in a better situation in order to better fulfill the human rights expectations that we have towards that supplier. And then maybe just to pick one or two other obligations. One, I think, very important just to mention is that the directive clearly states that the companies have to engage with stakeholders in a meaningful way throughout the implementation of their due diligence process. And all companies have to implement a notification mechanism and complaints procedure, which should make it possible for any and all people along their supply chain, along their chain of activities, or anyone else that has a complaint to file that complaint with the company, also on an anonymous basis. And the companies will then have to investigate that issue. And if they find it to be founded or a founded complaint, they will have to act upon it. Okay, the other two, I think, are kind of self-explanatory. The companies also have to monitor the effectiveness of their policy and measures, and they have to communicate publicly on their due diligence. Next slide, please. Okay, the final part I want to point out about the CSDDD is the access to justice, which is also something that we focus on very much. There are three main components to the access to justice complex, one being the complaints mechanism of companies that I just mentioned and explained to you, which is one of the due diligence obligation. The other one, you can see that there is a complaints procedure to supervisory authorities. So the directive says that when the member states implement the directive, they also have to implement and establish so-called supervisory authorities that are charged with the control of the compliance with the directive and the national laws. So they are the ones who will be able to impose fines, etc., and will be able to ask the companies for more information. So it kind of gives like two ways of complaints. So one being directly with the company, but also one being with the authorities. So that means you give your complaint directly to the authorities, and the authorities will then have to investigate the issues and act accordingly. And finally, one important issue that's also a novelty, Janis mentioned that we also have a German law in place that is pretty similar to what is coming now with the European directive. However, what was not included in the German law was civil liability. There were some intents to include it, but it did not end up in the law. However, now with respect to the European law, there was an agreement. So now people that are affected, whose rights are violated by a European company or even a non-European company, as long as they fulfill the thresholds that I just pointed out, they will be able to go in front of a European court of one of the member states and then sue the company because of the violation of the rules of this directive. Of course, it's also important to mention this will not always be easy, because usually, at least in Germany and I think most European systems, the claimant will always have to prove that there has been a violation, and the violation has to have taken place with respect to the due diligence obligation, which then leads to a human rights violation. So this will be probably very difficult, because for people living somewhere on the other end of the world to prove that a European company did not, for example, conduct their risk analysis in the proper manner, or they did not take preventive measures in a correct manner, it will be difficult. But I think the legislator, they saw this imbalance, and they also included some so-called safeguards, I would say. So the member states, when they transpose this directive, they will have to make sure that there will be representative action possible, and no prohibitive costs will be imposed on the claimant. And also another example is that the courts will be able to require the disclosure of evidence from the companies if they have a certain basis for that. Yes, and with that, I will conclude my very fast overview of the most important provisions of the CSDDD and hand back over to Janis.
Thank you very much, Lena. Yeah, you can go over to next slides. So Lena explained now the obligations for the EU and the very large companies outside of the EU. So the law doesn't have any direct effect on it, but of course it will have an indirect effect, and it can have a very big one. So the idea of the law is that the very large EU companies look at their supply chain, see what risks they have, and then try to find solutions together with the suppliers in a sense of partnership, trying to improve the situation slowly, trying to see how in the next years or even decades they can come to a solution that is good both for the buying companies, for the suppliers, but of course, in the end, it should all be good for the workers, for the farmers, for the rights holders. Kind of like this relationship of partnership that leads to good business relationships and resilience. Then we also know that this is not how the business world works, at least not all the time. So you have the big companies that have a lot of power and that can dictate certain contracts or certain business relationships. So what we sometimes see with the German law that we already have, but that we also expect to see with the CSDDD, is that some of the big buying companies will just push down their obligations to their suppliers and say, well, you have to sign in the contract that you're human rights violation free. You have to make sure that you don't have any human rights violations. And of course, there's always a threat of, if there are human rights violations or environmental damage found, that the contract is terminated. So the legislator was aware of these dangers and had put some safeguards in place in the law that I will show to you now on the next slide. And I think, yeah, I'm gonna point out a few points from the law that should help with that, or should safeguard that the obligations are not just put down and then overwhelm the suppliers, especially small and medium enterprises or even micro enterprises that supply the big buyers. So first, Lena has already mentioned, is the risk-based approach. So it can be very hard for suppliers to deal with all their buying companies and like fill out questionnaires for all their different buyers. It can be too overwhelming. So what the law wants is a risk-based approach. That, well, the buying companies, the big companies, should only target their very high-risk areas. They don't have to target everyone. So if there's a company in their supply chain and they know they have an excellent track record, we work together for years on like very good projects, then this can be a low-risk supplier and they don't have to put any burden on the supplier. And then in the same way, they should request information only where it's necessary. So if they know that a certain chemical is often used in a certain supply chain in a certain region, then they should ask the suppliers, do you use this chemical? How do you make sure that this chemical doesn't harm your workers and doesn't harm the environment? But they don't necessarily have to ask about everything that is covered by the law. That makes it very hard for the suppliers to answer a question about something that maybe is not relevant for them. And then Lena mentioned this already, and I think this is a very crucial point. The idea of the law, and I think this is something that we will have to also enforce, is that the buying companies have to look at their purchasing practices. They can't just say, well, our suppliers have to make sure that they don't have these violations. No, we as a company have to make sure that the business model works in a way that the delivery times, the pricing, it works in a way that our suppliers can then also protect human rights. So if we want, for example, a living income in our supply chain for farmers, then the EU companies also have to make sure that they pay enough to their suppliers to make sure that there's enough money to then pay high enough income and wages. And they also have to support their suppliers. There's an investment duty in the law. There has to be targeted and proportional support. It's forbidden to just pass on the costs of verification for suppliers, and also the opportunity for suppliers that if they have done one kind of verification, certification, that they can use it for all their buyers or not just for the one they've done it with. So there's all these points that are in the law aimed at protecting suppliers. Another one that is very important for us is to make sure that the contract terms between the buying company and the suppliers are fair and non-discriminatory, and based on the idea of partnership, so not just pushing it down. And then last, termination of a contract. This is not, if you find a human rights risk or a risk for environmental damage, the EU companies are not allowed to just terminate the contract. No, they have to work together with the supplier to come up with a solution. And I don't know that much about the specific sector and the agricultural supply chain, but maybe to give you one example, in the cocoa sector, that there's the Human Rights Convention forbidding child labor, but then we know that for many families, this is the only way to come to a living income, that everyone in the family works and creates the income so that they can survive and live well. So how do we deal with that? We have cocoa buying companies like chocolate producers in the EU that know that in their supply chain they have children working. So if they know that, they shouldn't just say, okay, we're not allowed to do that, we have to leave now. No, they have to work together with the rights holders, with the families, with the parents, with the children and their suppliers to see how can we come up with a solution that works for everyone. Maybe they have to pay more so that the workers and the farmers can earn more. And then this allows the children not to be on the field, but go to school. So they should come up with a in the relations of partnership. And also what is very important that also Lena has mentioned, they can't just decide, oh, we think this is good for the rights holders, for the workers, for the farmers. They have to talk to them and they have to get their opinion and then come up with a way that works for everyone and actually improves the lives of farmers, of workers, and not just decide on their own. So this is kind of like what is in the law, but it will be a long process and we will see problems and challenges. And it's very important for us to also hear back from you what you see as challenges now or in the next years, so that we can use that to adapt, to support, and also to enforce. So if big EU companies are just pushing down their obligations, then the authorities in the EU should work against that and sanction them. So 2 more slides before we go into the Q&A section, the question section. I also want to point out, because it's often seen as something that can be harmful or dangerous for suppliers, but there's also a lot of chances for that. So if you already have sustainability as a supplier, it can be a big competitive advantage and a unique selling point, because EU companies now have to aim for sustainability. So they will look for suppliers that can offer that for them. It gives a chance for suppliers to demand responsible purchasing practices and ideally counteract price pressure at the expense of environmental and social standards. And as I said, if there's a problem, EU authorities can support. So, but we know it will be a long process and it will be challenging at points. So on the next slide, I put together some of the support measures that the EU and the German government are offering. So I think the GIZ project that has invited us is one example how the German government wants to support. There's also some guidelines that will come from the Commission and support from the member states. I want to point two projects out before we end and go to the question section. So there will be an EU help desk aimed at partner countries for governments, for suppliers, but also for civil society and rights holders, and direct them to the information and training they need to understand the laws and how they can use them. And at the moment, it's still very much focused on the textile supply chain, but I know they're also going to other countries. There's a network of responsible business help desks that is also specifically aimed at suppliers to make sure that they get the training and the information they need to deal with new requirements and to use this new law as an opportunity for improvement. That's how we want to end it. Our information, I hope it was useful to you, and we're very happy to answer any questions that you might have. And now, or also, of course, you can always contact us with our email addresses if you have any questions directly or through Stefan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lena and Janis, for this very excellent and presentation, the good overview. I think many of our more than 90 participants, they really appreciated it. So in the name of the participants, first of all, thank you very much, dear colleagues. What we did not mention, maybe that Lena and Janis are working for the GIZ Sector program, Corporate and Public Responsibility for Sustainable Supply Chains. So they are really experts on these topics, as you noticed, of course, dear ladies and gentlemen. All right, we have around 12, 13 minutes to go. In the chat, there was only, I saw one question from Marcus. And Marcus, if you want, you can open your mic and your camera, and then you can ask our colleagues directly, please. Please, Marcus.
Stefan, thank you very much. Marcus Dietrich, working with the Alliance for Product Quality, supporting companies on complying with international certifications. We've sort of looked at CSDDD as well as an probably anchor for our work. But in discussions, we found that like certification doesn't play, or does play only an indirect role in this risk-based approach. So in your opinion, looking forward, what role could certificates, being at like ISO standards, for example, or private standards play for suppliers to actively signal, yes, we are compliant, please choose us, as you mentioned, this competitive advantage?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think it's a very important one. So as you said, there's no CSDDD certification yet, but I mean, it's all based on the OSC guidelines, the UN guiding principles, and I think a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives already use this or support this, and will also see how they can like change the way they work to include this more. So I would say that participation in multi-stakeholder initiatives and certification schemes that already exist, I don't know the specific ones in the agricultural sector, can show to buying companies, here we have a company here we have a supplier that is already very strong on due diligence or on human rights, environmental protection, depends on the specific initiative. And this will cover probably most of what the CSDDD requires, but I think that most initiatives will also see how do they have to change their requirements to cover all aspects that the CSDDD wants. I think that's something in the next few years.
Thank you, Janis, and also thank you, Marcus, for the question. Is it okay like this, Marcus?
Yeah, so you do see some like progress. I mean, we've seen standards like Global GAP, which started off as an agricultural standard, now including social standards as well. So do you see private standard setters adapting to CSDDD? And then in the end, there will be certificates that say, yes, a company complying with this certificate will be CSDDD compliant.
So I can just, I was at the iSteel conference, this Association of Sustainability Initiatives, a few weeks ago, And for them, CSDDD is a big topic. What they say, what we also support, is that you can't really certify CSDDD compliance because it's an individual process. Every company has to look at their supply chain, at their individual risk, and then find individual solutions for it and remediation. But all initiatives that I think want to be relevant, they will have to see how they can tie in with these processes and how they can support what the CSDDD requires. So I think, yes, in the next few years, probably all, or at least most initiatives will see how they can tie in and support the processes that CSDDD requires, even if they can't say, we certify CSDDD compliance, but they can support the process, definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to both of us. I still see there's a hand raised by Jorge Ricardo. And so if you don't mind, you just open your mic and your camera, please. And then feel free, Jorge, to ask your question, please.
I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me now? Thank you. My name is Ricardo Jorge from Mozambique. I work for National Institute for Promotion Small and Medium Enterprise under the Region Center of Mozambique. But I think this might be probably the question for many of us. Is it the law that is being shared with us in this expert talk affect German companies or European companies which are operating in Mozambique, or only or also the companies which have a possible benefit in some fund or grant from European Union and entities or World Bank are also affected for this law. But also, I would like to understand if within the process of this, the implement.
Now the connection has stuck. Yeah?
Could you repeat the last part of your question? I think the first part we got with respect to the application to companies, but the second part we did not understand.
I was asking if is there companies or government entities in Mozambique, for example, which can be trained from this project to be able to support the SMEs on the implementation of this various law and this various program. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure I understood the second part, but I will start with the first part. Maybe if the who the law applies to, if the law would also be applicable to German companies, for example, in Mozambique. That's what I understood. And the answer would be yes, it would be applicable. For example, the law also applies to groups of companies. So if, for example, that's like a subsidiary of a German company, that would also apply to the law, but then maybe the mother company in Germany could fulfill the obligations for the Mozambique company. But it's important to know that for groups of companies, it's also applicable, so that the companies are not able to kind of circumvent the provisions of the directive by just establishing new companies, right? But if it's just any company in Mozambique, the law will only apply to it in case they reach these thresholds that we looked at before. And then for the second one, maybe Janis, you want to come in?
Yeah, I can do the second one. As I understood it, asking for support measures specifically for SMEs in Mozambique. And I can't speak specifically for SMEs in Mozambique, but I know that it's a big, that's very important for the German government and also for the EU to offer these support measures for SMEs. So as I said, there's like in our sister project, there's a lot happening in the textile supply chain in South Asia and Southeast Asia. But I know that these projects present today have a lot of activity in the agricultural supply chains and specifically in Africa. Magnus, I can see your raised hand. Maybe you want to directly respond on that.
Yeah, Jorge, boa tarde, Mozambique. Yes. We, as a program, we have also a market facilitation unit, yeah, and of course our resources are limited. But what we will do is in future, in cooperation with other projects from GIZ, to try also to prepare an e-learning program. No, we are already working and have a platform, yeah. So this could be also one possibility to get also new information, yeah, and also to get some training over this e-learning system, yeah. And what Janis already has said, this is very important also to our donor, which is among others also the EU, yeah. And I'm sure that also the EU delegation probably in Mozambique will also offer in future, yeah, at least some possibilities where there's a where small and medium entrepreneurs have the possibility to get more information over workshops and conferences. Yeah, and from our side, we will push this also over e-learning and also over this platform which we have in preparation. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. And I see that we have not much time left. There is one question from Simon the Wim, and also I would like to ask you just to open your mic. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you also for your presentations, Markart and Janis. Very interesting. I've been working in Ivory Coast on cashew nuts for the last 2 years on CSR, and now it says with the laws CSDDD. My question is, yeah, will there also be an overall, let's say, assessment on European level in terms of risk areas geographically or sectors that will be highlighted, and that will be also, let's say, first, yeah, critical areas, as it is also for the EUDR. They have also prepared it, sort of a risk areas, a risk scoring of countries. Is it also for the CSDDD prepared?
Okay, maybe I can start, and also, yeah, maybe I can start with that. Yes, so actually in the directive, there are a lot of provisions regarding the support of companies. So also the Commission, in collaboration with the member states, will pass guidelines. Also, for example, sector-specific guidelines, but also model contract clauses for the collaboration between companies and their suppliers. And yeah, this is a process that is starting right now, but I think we can expect a lot of support and more information on the implementation of the directive in the coming months from the Commission and from the member states. However, I'm not sure if there will be like a risk markup or something that you just mentioned. I'm not sure if it's going to be that specific, to be honest. Janis, maybe you want to add.
Yeah, I think the Commission guidelines will be important, but then also the CSDDD is taking established concepts and putting them into law. So I think all the kind of like sector-specific publications are still important. I don't know how active the OECD is in the agricultural sector, but I know that they cover many specific sectors with their business and human rights guidances. There will be work of multi-stakeholder initiatives, of course, and also we see that there's a lot of activity, both good and bad, in the kind of like consultancy sphere and with like software solutions. So I think there will be a lot coming up, and it will be important to see which are the credible ones, which are the ones that really use this this approach of supporting the companies with their efforts and not just like offering simple solutions of saying, well, this is a risk-free area or this like high-risk area, but like giving data and giving resources. I think this is something that will need to come more and more in the coming years, and it will be important to watch the space and see what is credible, what is fair and responsible. But yes, there will be a lot of support needed.
Yeah, thanks for your answers. So it could be also good if you can stay informed also about it. Thank you so much. Thank you also for organizing also this session. Also, Stefan, over to you.
Yes, thanks very much to all of you. And I do see that we have already 1 minute, 1 minute past 5 p.m. Central European time, so I would come to an end. But nevertheless, I have noticed that there are still 2 questions in the chat from Elke and Simon, and maybe I can ask Janis and Lena to answer to those questions in a written form when the chat is over. Yeah, so that also Simon and Elke will get a response to their question. I still have some final remarks to other questions. Of course, all of you get an email with a presentation, of course, and as you have noticed, we have recorded it. You will get a link to the full recorded session, which will be published on our webpage, most probably next week, and then you can listen once again to the full presentation, to all the question answers, and of course you get the full presentation as I have mentioned. I would also like to ask you to have a look at the invitation, because in the invitation there was the full expert talks which are coming this year, 7 in a row, and so you are mostly invited also to join those kind of expert talks. Last but not least, let me thank Janis and Lena for this very excellent presentation and for the good answering of all the questions. And yeah, if there are no further remarks for the moment, I would say thanks very much to all of you, and we stay in touch. And in case if there are any specific questions, you have the email contact of Janis, Lena, and also myself, so do not hesitate to come back to us. Thank you very much, colleagues, people from all over the world, and I wish you a nice afternoon and evening. All the best.
Thank you very
and
much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.